In the beginning of the Elder Scrolls universe, there existed two conflicting original forces. These forces were known as the Anu and the Padume. These two forces represented the primordial struggle between order and chaos. The interplay between these forces of order and chaos led to the creation of their own souls, Anwi, El, and Sithis, respectively. The continued struggle between these two forces led to the creation of the Arbus, the universe in which the Elder Scrolls games take place. From the Arbus, the Et Ada, or original spirits, began to distinguish themselves as individual entities, following the introduction of time from Auriel, also known as Akatosh. This whole period of the Elder Scrolls lore can be rather confusing and contains some conflicting accounts, but the basic idea is this. Before creation, there is a conflict between the forces of order and chaos. Out of this primordial conflict arises Akatosh, god of time, and Lorkhan, the god of mortals. Whether by trickery or persuasion, depending on whether you ask an elf or a human, Lorkhan eventually convinces some of the other spirits to give up a portion of their power in order to create Mundus, the mortal plane of existence in the Elder Scrolls universe. The spirits who gave up some of their power to create Mundus became known as the Aedra, meaning our ancestors, while those who did not give up their power are known as the Daedra, meaning not our ancestors. After the creation of Mundus, Akatosh held a meeting of the Aedra at the Adamantine Tower in order to decide what they would do with Lorkhan, as they were upset about having given up some of their power to create Mundus, whether this was because they were persuaded or tricked to do so. The council decided to separate Lorkhan from his divine heart, which was cast down to Nirn, where it eventually became the Red Mountain volcano. Lorkhan's heart empowered Mundus to sustain itself, allowing the remaining Aedra to leave Mundus for the realm of Aetherius. Most people of Tamriel worship and venerate the Aedra, but who exactly the Aedra are is not agreed upon by the peoples of Tamriel. This has led to the development of various pantheons and different perspectives on the various Aedra. In this video, we're going to explore each of the pantheons of the playable races in the Elder Scrolls games, in order to see how they relate with one another. With that bit of introduction out of the way, let's get right into the Imperial Pantheon, as that will be the one most familiar, especially to players of Oblivion and Skyrim.
Blessings of the 8 divines upon you. How may I help?
The 8 divines of the Imperial Pantheon, we'll get to the question of the 9th divine in a bit, are as follows. Akatosh, the dragon god of time and chief of the Pantheon. Arkay, god of the cycle of life and death, and of mortals, burials, and funeral rites. Dibella, the goddess of beauty and love. Julianos, the god of wisdom and logic. Kinnereth, goddess of air, wind, sky, and the elements. Mara, goddess of love and compassion, and also the mother goddess. Stendar, god of compassion, mercy, justice, charity, righteous rule, and might and merciful forbearance. And Zenithar, the god of work and commerce. The 8 divines are Saint Alicia's attempts to make a pantheon that would synthesize the gods of both her Nordic and Aeliad allies, following her successful slave revolt against the ruling Aeliads who did not eventually join her. The Imperials understand that these 8 divines are compassionate and good deities because they willingly participated in creation, unlike the other Aedra that withdrew upon realizing that their power was being drained to create Mundus. The 9th divine that was added to the Pantheon later is Talos. Talos was once a human being, also known as Tiber Septim. Many of the details about Tiber Septim's life are disputed amongst the sources within the lore, but one thing is clear. Tiber Septim unified all the nations of Tamriel through conquest, beginning the Third Era, and upon his death, it is believed that he ascended to godhood as Talos. All the emperors from the beginning of the Third Era until the Oblivion Crisis were part of the Septim lineage. During the Fourth Era, the Great War between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion ended with a treaty known as the White Gold Concordat. Among other things, this treaty led to a ban on Talos worship within the Empire. This ban would be one of the primary drivers for the civil war between the Empire and the Stormcloaks that takes place during Skyrim. Speaking of Skyrim, let's turn next to the Nordic Pantheon. The gods of the Nordic Pantheon are as follows. Sjor, god of the underworld and king of the gods. He's also the Nordic understanding of Lorkhan. Sun, god of trials against adversity, the shield thane to Sjor, who defends the Whalebone Bridge in Savangard. Stun, god of ransom, and the Nordic precursor to Stendar. Kain, goddess of the storm and widow of Sjor, Nordic understanding of Kinnereth, and sometimes understood as the head of the pantheon since Sjor's death. Mara, goddess of love and handmaiden of Kain. Dibella, goddess of beauty. Orki, god of mortality, and the Nordic understanding of Arche. Alduin, the world eater. There is a debate over whether or not Alduin is simply the Nordic understanding of Akatosh, or a different entity entirely. Parthenax refers to Alduin as the firstborn of Akatosh. Ysmir, dragon of the north and the hero god of mankind, the Nordic understanding of Talos. In general, the Nordic Pantheon shares a lot in common with the Imperial Pantheon, but generally has a greater focus on the warrior or battle-related attributes of these gods. The Almer Pantheon consists of Auriel, the soul of Nyl, and chief of the Elven Pantheon. Auriel is often associated with Akatosh, but the elves focus less on the dragon and time aspects of Akatosh and instead focus on Auriel's role in defeating Lorkhan, who they see as evil. Trinimac, the warrior god, considered by some to be the strongest of the Aedra. He eventually becomes Malakath, but we'll get to that later when we cover the Orcish Pantheon. Magnus, the god of sorcery and the architect of Mundus. Magnus abandoned the Mundus project shortly before its completion, and in doing so he tore a hole into Aetherius, creating the sun and allowing Magicka into the mortal realm. Ciribane, the god ancestor of magic and the apprentice's god. Finehaster, the ancestor god and protector of the Somerset Isles. Yefri, primarily related to the Bosmer Pantheon, known as Yifri to the Wood Elves, but exists within some unknown role in the Almer Pantheon. Mara, goddess of love and marriage, pretty much the same as the other Pantheon's versions. Xarxes, scribe to Auriel, related to the genealogies and accomplishments of the elves. The distinguishing feature of the Almer Pantheon is that Auriel is at its head, and many elves consider themselves to be direct descendants of Auriel. Elves generally dislike Lorkhan because they believe that he never should have started the creation of the world in the first place, because in doing so, he cursed the elves to be finite mortal beings, even if their lifespans are still considerably longer than that of humans. The Almer desire to return to godhood, and to the state of the universe before the creation of the mortal realm, even if that means destroying it. The chief of the Bosmer Pantheon is also Auriel, the time dragon king of gods. They have a fairly similar view to Auriel as the Altmer. The next is Yifri. Although Auriel is the head of their pantheon, the Bosmer have the closest ties to Yifri. Yifri is the storyteller god, and he made a deal with the Bosmer so that they would be given the power to defeat their enemies so long as they followed some certain conditions. This deal, which is known as the Green Pact, requires Bosmer to not hurt any of the plant life in their homeland of Valenwood, and to be strict carnivores, including a requirement to eat the flesh of their fallen foes. Eus, the god of animals. They also follow some gods from other pantheons, such as Mara, Stendar, Arche, etc. Despite technically having multiple gods in their pantheon, the primary defining god of Bosmer worship is definitely Yifri, and the religion more or less entirely centers around him. Unlike the other pantheons that we have looked at so far, the Dunmer do not revere or worship the Aedra. But for some time in their history, they have worshipped a group known as the Tribunal, a group of 3 deities that ascended to godhood in the First Era. And for some time of their history, they have worshipped a few of what they call good Daedra. The Tribunal consists of Almalexia, the Lady of Mercy, the most popular of the Tribunal, and she is known for many of the same qualities as Auriel or Akatosh, such as immortality and genealogy. Vivek, the warrior poet god, represents the spirit and duality of the Dunmer people. And Sothastil, the least known of the Tribunal, he is the one who discovered Kagranak's tools to achieve divinity. After the destruction of Vivek City and the eruption of the Red Mountain in the Fourth Era, worship of the Tribunal ceased, and the Tribunal were reduced to saints rather than gods in the eyes of the Dunmer. The Dunmer have then returned to the worship of what they understand as the 3 good Daedra. The 3 good Daedra are Azura, the goddess of dusk and dawn, Boethia, god of plots who convinced the Dunmer to renounce all ties to the Almer and start a new nation, and Mephala, the web spinner or spider god. The Dunmer also acknowledge 4 particular Daedra as especially difficult and problematic. They know these as the 4 corners of the House of Troubles. These are Malakath, Molag Bal, Sheogorath, and Mehrunes Dagon. The Dunmer Pantheon is unique because most peoples of Tamriel consider the gods that they revere to be evil. Boethia in particular is seen as one of the most heinous Daedric princes by most other peoples in Tamriel. The Breton Pantheon is fairly straightforward, as they pretty much just worship a collection of human and elven gods that we've already covered. The Bretons worship Akatosh, Arche, Dibella, Julianos, Kinnereth, Sheor, the Breton version of Shor, which is pretty much the same view that the elves have in terms of their view of Lorkhan, Magnus, Mara, Finaster, Stendar, Yifri, and Zenithar. There's not much else to say about the Breton Pantheon, as they seem to mostly agree with the views about each specific god from whatever pantheon they come from. In stark contrast with the Breton Pantheon, the Khajit Pantheon has a different understanding or different name for virtually all of the gods that they share in common with other pantheons. First is Akka, the originator of dragons and time, and the precursor to Alkosh. Alkosh being the Khajit understanding of Akatosh, who takes the place of Akka. There's also Alkan, the Khajit understanding of Alduin, or similar to Alduin, firstborn of Akka, immortal, and has the ability to devour souls. The Khajit also have Azura, the Khajit name for Azura, central figure in the Khajit mythology and sometimes credited with their creation. Bandar, the bandit god of the Khajit, and the representation of their cleverness. Boethra, the Khajit name for Boethia. Hermora, the Khajit name for Hermaeus Mora. Hircine, the prince of the hunt and father of man-beasts. Yus, the god of animals. Ja Kage, the moon god that has 2 aspects, Jode and June, representing Ern's 2 moons, the larger being Maser, and the smaller being Secunda. There's also Kinarthi, the Khajit understanding of Kinnereth, Lorkhaj, the Khajit understanding of Lorkhan, Mephala, the Khajit understanding of Mephala, Magrus, the Khajit god of magic and the sun, pretty much the same as the Altmeri god Magnus, Mara, Mehrunes, the Khajit name for Mehrunes Dagon, Nirni, the Khajit interpretation of the planet Nirn itself, Noctra, the Khajit interpretation of nocturnal, Rajin, the Khajit god of thieves, Riddlethar, the Khajit god of 2 moons dance, more understood as a set of guidelines rather than an entity, but not the same kind of rigid dogma that the Bosmer have with the Green Pact, for example. They have Sangin, the Khajit name for sanguine, Shegorath, the Khajit version of Sheogorath, also known as the Skooma Cat, Serendar, Khajit version of Stendar, Varmina, Khajit name for Vermina, Yifr, the Khajit version of Yifri, and responsible for turning the forests of elsewhere into deserts and jungle, but with Azura's help, they were able to adapt. The Khajit Pantheon is somewhat complex. They have their own unique gods, but they also have their own names for most of the gods that they share with other pantheons, although the names are generally similar. From a linguistics perspective, I think it's interesting that the names of the deities that the Khajit changed, they do so to make them linguistically similar to the name of their own people. For example, Kinreth being changed to Kinarthi reflects the KH at the beginning of Khajit. And another example is Sanguine being changed to Sanguine, reflecting the double I in Khajit. The Khajit Pantheon is a rabbit hole of its own, so if you're enjoying this video and you'd like to see a deeper dive into the Khajit Pantheon, or any of the other pantheons, let me know in the comments. Anyway, let's move on. The Yudan, or Red Guard Pantheon, consists of the following gods. Diagna, the orichalc god of the sideways blade, an avatar of Hunding that eventually achieved permanence. Hunding, the Make-Way god, the Yudan spirit of perseverance that incarnates in history whenever it is necessary to make way for the Red Guard people. This has happened 3 times in history, twice in the First Era during the Regatta invasion, and once during the Tiber War. Leki, the goddess of the sword spirit and the patron of swordsmanship. Morwa, the fertility goddess, who is often portrayed as having 4 arms in order to grab more husbands. Unsi, the warrior god, who taught the Red Guards how to pull their knives into swords. Satakal, the Yudan god of everything, a fusion of Anu and Padme. Satakal is responsible for destroying each world and bringing about the next cycle, somewhat similar to the Nordic understanding of Alduin. Rubka, also known as Tall Papa, the chief deity of the Yudan Pantheon. Tall Papa was the first god to learn to survive the hunger of Satakal. Tall Papa taught the Yudan gods to walkabout, a process that allows the spirits to persist beyond the cycles directed by Satakal, and that is how they became gods. Sep is the snake god and the Yudan version of Lorkhan. He convinces some of the gods to help him create an easier version of the walkabout, which ultimately becomes the mortal plane. Similar to Lorkhan, Sep is also punished for his role in creating the mortal world. Hava, the goddess of the air and the storm, often depicted as a bird and similar to the Nordic concept of kine. Tuhuaka, the god of souls, caretaker of the far shores, which is the Yudan understanding of the afterlife, and is sometimes associated with Arke. Zet, the god of agriculture, and Zeki, the water goddess and daughter of Zet. Overall, the Yudan Pantheon shares the most parallels with the Nordic Pantheon. Both are warrior-heavy cultures, and this is reflected in their understandings of the gods as primarily warrior and battle-related. Both Nords and Red Guards also have the parallel understanding of the afterlife and the cyclical nature of time as the world is destroyed and remade infinitely. Unlike the other races of Tamriel, the Argonians don't really have much of a pantheon, per se. We don't have a lot of information about Argonian religion, but what we do know is that it centers around the history of their homeland in Blackmarsh. The Argonians venerate these sentient histories in a similar concept to the real-world religious understanding of ancestor veneration, but they don't necessarily worship the histories like the other peoples worship the Aedra or the Daedra. The Argonians do acknowledge the existence of Sithis, and indeed some Argonians are given to the Dark Brotherhood to be trained from birth and become known as Shadow Scales. Since the Argonians' relationship to the Hist is geographically tied to Blackmarsh, some Argonians who emigrate to other nations break away from their ancestral religion and instead worship the local deities. An example of this is Shavi, who worships Zenithar, the god of commerce. Similar to the Argonians, the Orcs don't necessarily have a pantheon because they really only venerate or worship one god, Malakath. The chief deity of Orcs religion, Malakath, also known as Malak or Malok, is the Daedric prince of the spurned and ostracized. Malakath used to be the elven god Trinimac, but when Trinimac tried to get involved to stop the Chimer, the precursors to the Dunmer, from leaving the Somerset Isles, he was consumed by the Daedric prince Poethia and then released out the other side as Malakath. It's uncertain whether this myth is meant to be taken literally, but what is likely true is that clash between Trinimac and Boethia led to his corruption into Malakath in some form or fashion. Orcs who follow Malakath are bound by the Code of Malakath, a set of religious doctrine that they must abide by. The Code of Malakath is fairly straightforward and a generally honorable code. The rules include: do not steal, do not kill, do not attack without reason, fight with honor, and protect your tribe. Those who break the rules must pay the blood price. In order to pay the blood price, the offender must spill their own blood until the victim of the crime is satisfied. And with that, we have successfully covered all 10 of the playable races and their pantheons within the Elder Scrolls universe. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, and if you'd like to see more of this kind of content on my channel, please consider subscribing. Thank you again so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.